Hello once again, Men of Desert View. Mike Bowman, your pastor of Adult and Family Ministries here. I pray that this has been a wonderful fall season of Bible study for you and for your group thus far. This video is for the week of November the 11th, and it covers Lesson 8 in your Life Change book called Abram's Call, from Genesis chapter 11, verse 27, through Genesis chapter 12, verse 20. Now, in this video, as always, I'm hoping to do three things for you. First of all, give you a little background and context for what's going on here. Secondly, give you some things to look for in the text as you study it. And thirdly, hopefully provide you with some useful applications and takeaways. All right, so let's get started with the discussion around the background and the context of this particular text. Now, as you've seen over the past few weeks of our study, the whole earth got an ultimate reset. The worldwide cataclysmic flood, which God used to preserve every known land animal. And I'm going to ask him about why he chose to preserve mosquitoes, wasps, and scorpions. We're going to have a conversation about that later. But praise be to God, he also preserved 8 human beings. In the form of Noah, his 3 sons, and their wives, who would become the ancestors of every human being on the planet today. And then we observed the post-flood genealogies throughout chapter 10, explaining where all the ancient peoples and nations of the earth descended from. And that account is followed, of course, by the Tower of Babel incident in chapter 11, at which point God purposefully divides up the nations by causing them to speak in widely different languages. And then the narrative turns specifically to one bloodline, one genealogy, starting with Noah's son Shem, all the way down to one man who will become the main character of the next 13 chapters of the book. So it's here that the story then turns from a broad history of the descent and origin of nations to a focus on one very special man and his family. And that man, of course, is Abram, whose name means exalted father. Now, outside of Jesus, Abram, or Abraham, is undoubtedly the most famous religious figure in the world, as he's a revered and venerated man in the world's 3 great religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And we'll see why as we study the text further today. So let's take a look together at this week's passage. Here are some things to look for as you study the text. Abram's story begins with the end of chapter 11, here in verse 27 through 32, in which we discover some very important information about Abram's background. We learn that Abram grew up in the city of Ur. Now, that is a real city that really existed in a real place. Ur was located 170 miles inland from the Persian Gulf, and it was about 100 miles from the city of Basra in modern-day Iraq. Ur was a city that was actually lost to history until it was rediscovered and excavated about 100 years ago in the 1920s. Now, it's believed that Ur was founded right around 1700 years before Abram's time, first by the Sumerians and then later resettled by the Chaldeans, who will later be known to history as the Babylonians. Now, we know that Ur was a great center of commerce and wealth and technology for the day, art, multiple trades, and the city had many impressive features, including an imposing defensive wall, expansive houses for its citizenry, advanced sewage systems, and even plumbing, with hot and cold running water. Ur was also a great center of pagan worship. Many gods in the Chaldean pantheon were worshipped there. So most likely, Abram and his family were polytheistic, worshiping many gods, and they probably came from a long line of pagan worshipers. Somewhere in the lineage there in chapter 11, they strayed away from worshiping the one true God of Noah, replacing him with these multiple false gods. And we know this from Joshua 24:2, which says, "And Joshua said to all the people, 'Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your fathers lived beyond the Euphrates, Terah, the father of Abraham and of Nahor, and they served other gods.'" So we can likely conclude that when this family left Ur behind, they were giving up many comforts and conveniences, much like going from a first world to a majority world experience today. But it's probably the case that at least when they departed Ur, they didn't leave behind their practice of worshiping many gods. So now comes the question, why would Abram's father Terah leave such a great place to live like the city of Ur? Well, we don't know for sure. But one potential clue we have is what the text tells us here in the concluding verses of chapter 11. We find out that Abram's family has endured a tragic loss. Abram's brother Haran has died. And sadly, the text tells us that he died in the presence of his father Terah. Now, can you just imagine what that would have been like for Terah? Some of you know firsthand. Some of you know the pain of losing a child, either in childhood or in adulthood. We don't know how old Haran was when he died, but we do know that he was old enough to have 3 children, including his son, Lot, whose story we're going to follow in the chapters to come. Now, what I find interesting here is that Haran's wife's name is not mentioned, while Abram and his brother Nahor's wives' names are mentioned. Now, perhaps this means that Haran's wife died with her husband? Unknown. This is, by the way, verse 29, when we first learn of Abram's wife Sarai, whose name means my princess. We also learn that Sarai was infertile, unable to have children. So it's likely that here's yet another painful burden that Abram is bearing, having lost a brother and now dealing with infertility. And this would have been especially painful and even shameful in this culture for Sarai, as the inability to produce an heir or a line of descendancy would mean a loss of social status and property and future security. Probably even worse, infertility during this era was seen as a sign of accursedness, that someone was literally cursed if they were unable to have children of their own. Now, we also learned some other stuff here in verse 29 that would be absolutely bizarre to us today. That Nahor, Abram's brother, married his niece, Milcah, the daughter of his deceased brother Haran. Similarly, we'll also learn a few verses later that Abram's wife Sarai is also his half-sister. Now, we know this because he tells the king of Gerar in chapter 20, verse 12, that Sarai is the daughter of his father, but not the daughter of his mother. More about that later. So, why are these realities of marrying close relatives socially acceptable during this period? Well, back in that day and age, it wasn't frowned upon for a person to marry within the family. And if you think about it, people who lived closer to the creation event and also to the flood event would have been more comfortable with such an idea because the options of who to marry would be far less plentiful than today. So if you pulled up your Match.com page back in that day and age, a lot of your close relatives would appear on your potential matches list. A few chapters ago, your group was probably faced with the question, okay, so who was Cain's wife? She was probably his sister. I know, ooh, gross, but those were the realities back in that day and age. Now, what else is the text telling us here? We find out that Lot, Abram's nephew, goes on this journey with Terah, Abram, and Sarai, and probably a few other relatives and servants from Ur to a city which, interestingly, shares its name with Lot's father, Haran. Only they didn't originally intend to move to Haran, the text tells us. Their original plan was to move to Canaan. Now, is it just a coincidence that they moved to a city that shares its name with Terah's deceased son? Maybe. I mean, it does make you wonder, though, doesn't it? Could the name of this city be the very thing that drew Terah to want to live there? Could this have been a means by which Terah could honor his deceased son, Haran? We don't know for sure. But another valid reason why they might have chosen to remain in Haran was that it too was a significant city. It was an important center of trade. It offered real economic opportunity to Terah and to his family. All we do know for sure is that Terah apparently changed his plan and remained in Haran until he died there at the age of 205. Now, let's take a minute to discuss the geography and the distances involved in this journey for a second. Haran, which is also a very real place and happens to be the modern day city of Haran in southeast Turkey, is 740 miles away from Ur. Now that's an equivalent distance from Phoenix to Amarillo, Texas. And remember, they would have been taking this journey by foot. And Canaan is just over 1,000 miles away from Ur, not as the crow flies, but as a person in Abram's time, and for most people in modern times, would take for this trip on a curved path through the heart of what's known as the Mesopotamian Crescent, starting out over in southern Iraq, moving northwest through the rest of Iraq, through Syria, into parts of Turkey, and then turning southwest back through Syria, through parts of Jordan, and into modern-day Israel. So this journey was not someplace right next door. It was a journey of hundreds of miles. It would have taken many, many days to complete. Now let's keep going. Let's turn the page and look at what we can observe here in chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. In verse 1, we observe that the Lord specifically calls Abram to leave his country, leave his family, leave his father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. And then in verses 2 and 3, God says these stunning words to Abram. Verse 2, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And later in verse 7, God tells Abram that he will give this promised land of Canaan to Abram's offspring. Wow. I mean, this is quite a set of blessings God is pronouncing over Abram. God's promising three key things. Number one, an unknown land to his descendants. Second, that God would make a great nation through Abram, giving him many descendants, which is echoed in additional promises given to Abram in chapter 15, verse 5, and to his son Isaac in chapter 26, verse 4, and further confirmed by Abram's name change to Abraham, which means father of many nations, in chapter 17, verse 5. And then we have the third promise, that through Abram, all the families of the earth shall be blessed, which is a reference, of course, to the coming Messiah, Jesus Christ, who would come from Abram's bloodline. Not to mention a fourth promise, that God would bless those who bless Abraham and his descendants, and curse those who curse him and his descendants. And we can see how that has played out over the many centuries since. Now, keep in mind, these promises were given to a man who had no land at this time. He also had no children, and in fact, very little prospect of having any children. And even by the time of his death, 100 years later, Abraham witnessed only a limited fulfillment of these promises. Now, in terms of land, at the time of his death, the only land that he owned, apparently, was his burial site at Machpelah, which is located today in modern-day Hebron in the West Bank and is marked by the Al-Ibrahim Mosque. And in terms of descendants, Abraham had 8 sons when he died. Now, that's a lot of sons, but it's far from a great nation. And these sons were born from 3 different mothers: Sarah, mother of Isaac; Hagar, the mother of Sammy. Just kidding, just seeing if you're paying attention. Hagar was the mother of Ishmael. And Keturah, whom Abraham married after Sarah's death, who bore him 6 more sons, presumably the last 40 years of his life. And on a side note here, Genesis 25:1 identifies Keturah as Abraham's wife, while 1 Chronicles 1:32 identifies her as his concubine. Now, some say that she may have been both, since Genesis 25:6 seems to indicate that Abraham actually had more than one concubine. So, how did God make good on his promises to Abraham? Well, firstly, in terms of his promise of a promised land, we now know, of course, that God fulfilled this promise to Abraham's descendants by giving them a land of their own, the land of Canaan, which of course became the land of Israel and Judah, and was in their possession for just over 800 years, from about 1400 BC at the time of the conquest of Canaan until 586, when the kingdom of Judah fell to the Babylonians. And then, of course, they possessed the land for another 600 years, from the time of the return from the exile to the time of the diaspora after Jesus' resurrection. And then, of course, this land once again came under the rule of the descendants of Abraham when Israel became a nation in our time on May 14th, 1948. Secondly, in terms of God's promise to Abraham to make him a father of many nations, Isaac, of course, became the father of the nations of Israel and Edom, and Ishmael became the father of the Arabs and, some believe, Bedouin peoples in the area of the Arabian Peninsula. And you can read more about the 12 sons of Ishmael in Genesis 25, 12 through 18. And finally, we have the sons of Abraham's second wife, Keturah, whose descendants included the nations of Midian, Sheba, Dedan, and Shuha, all of which we can read about in other places in Scripture. So Abraham really did become the father of many nations and absolutely lived up to his namesake. Thirdly, God, of course, made good on his promise that all the families of the earth would be blessed through Abraham, in that Jesus Christ, God's only Son, God in the flesh, would descend from the line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In this sense, Abram, soon to be Abraham, is akin to a new Adam, through which the seed of whom will come the promised Messiah. And Mary, Jesus' mother, would celebrate the fulfillment of this promise to Abraham some 2,000 years later in her Magnificat, recorded in Luke chapter 1, verses 46 and 47, and 54 and 55. Now, let's take a look at verses 4 through 6, where Abram journeys to Canaan. Remember, Abraham went from comfortable, luxurious Ur to prosperous, opportunity-filled Haran to Canaan, living off the land in a tent, leaving behind his homeland, his kin, and his father's household, and all the creature comforts of home, all in obedience to God's call. And I'd encourage you to pay attention to where God has shown up to meet Abram thus far, first in Haran and then in Canaan. And let's remember who the people of Canaan actually are. These are the descendants of the fourth son of Noah's son Ham from Genesis chapter 10, verse 6. Then we see that God appears to Abram at Shechem, near the modern city of Nablus in Israel. And Shechem's a city we're going to see throughout Scripture. It's where Joseph is later buried, along with many other significant events that took place there. We observe that Abram built an altar there at Shechem, and then another one in the hill country between Bethel and Ai. And this is significant because Abram is building new altars to worship the one true God in a place that is filled already with altars to many pagan gods. All right, so let's take a look at the final part of our text today, verses 10 through 20. We observe, first of all, that a regional crisis is taking place. A widespread famine occurs, similar to the famine that we'll observe later in Genesis chapters 41 through 42, which, of course, contributes to bringing Joseph to power at that time and his brothers to Egypt, seeking a means of survival. Because the nations around Egypt understood that even if no rain fell from the sky, the Nile River, which was fed from the faraway interior of Africa, would still flow and feed the farms of Egypt. So Egypt was many of the surrounding nations' insurance policy in case of famine. In fact, we know from archaeological finds that for much of ancient Canaan's history, many of these nations would effectively be a vassal state of Egypt's, and the pharaohs would exert military control and even demand tributes be paid from these Canaanite rulers. So to deal with this famine, Abram, probably like many of his neighbors, travels to Egypt with his wife, with his servants, with his entire household. And what happens next is one of those stories that demonstrates the authenticity of the Bible. I mean, if you were going to make up a religion, you'd probably edit out these kinds of details from the text to make your main characters look as good as possible. But no, we see here that Abram is far from perfect and, in fact, acts a lot like we often do. He takes the path of self-preservation, and he tells Sarai to tell the Egyptians a half-truth about herself, that she is his sister, which is true. She is his half-sister, but to leave out the part about her being his wife because he believes that what's going to happen is they'll kill him in order to take her as a wife. So there's one thing we can be absolutely sure of from the text. Sarai was apparently a real knockout because Abram predicted what was going to happen. And sure enough, that is what happened. So think about that. Think about that. What would you do? What would you do? Would you trust God that he would protect you from a ruthless king? Or would you allow your wife to be taken as someone else's wife in order to save your own skin? Well, in this case, Abram settles on a half-truth that he believes is going to split the difference. So we know the choice that Abram made in this case, and further, that he would actually not learn his lesson from this episode, and spoiler alert, he's going to do this again in Genesis chapter 20 with the king of Gerar, telling that king also that Sarah was his sister, leaving out the part that she is also his wife. Well, God's not having it because he afflicts the Pharaoh with many plagues. Sound familiar to anyone? Causing the Pharaoh to somehow figured out what Abram has done. And here's what I think is really remarkable. Instead of killing both of them, which the Pharaoh absolutely had the power to do, since they had both participated in this deception, he instead chooses to give Sarai back to Abram and sends them away. Perhaps he feared further plagues if he took their lives. Bottom line here is that God saw to it that nothing would interfere with his promise and his plan to Abram, that he would bring a son through barren Sarai who would be the ancestor of the promised one, Jesus Christ. All right, so now it's time to ask ourselves the all-important question, how and why does any of this matter to us today? What are some takeaways? What are some applications for us today that we can glean from this text? Well, firstly, we can observe in a couple places in this story that Proverbs 16:9 rings true. And that says, "The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." What does that mean? Well, it means that yes, human beings do have a free will, but God is also sovereign, and he will see to it that his perfect will is done. Remember, Terah's original plan was to take his family to Canaan. Now, who do you think put that plan on his heart? I would wager that was probably the prompting of the Holy Spirit. But then Terah changed his mind and he put down roots in Haran instead. But God stepped in and he saw to it that his son Abram was called by the Lord himself to go to Canaan. And God made sure that his divine plan was carried out. And later, Abram, from a human point of view, almost torched God's plan of redemption by giving up his wife to another man to save his own skin. But God saw to it that this alternate timeline didn't play out and safely returned Sarai to Abram so that later Isaac could be born and God's plan ultimately fulfilled. So our first takeaway here is this: we cannot mess up God's plan. He will see it through. He will make sure that his purposes and plans are accomplished, often in spite of us and our goofy choices. Secondly, we can observe from this story and others like it throughout the scriptures that God's call often involves leaving behind what's familiar, comfortable, and known in order to embrace the unfamiliar, the uncomfortable, and the unknown. And that can often leave us wondering, how could this be God's will? I mean, I'm pretty sure that question passed through the minds of people like Daniel in the lion's den, Gideon before the raid on the Midianites with just 300 men, and Mary traveling all the way from Bethlehem, 9 months pregnant with no place to stay. See, we can be right in the thick of it, and yet at the same time be right in the center of the will of God. Thirdly, we can see from this text that God keeps his promises, some of which we may not get to see the full fulfillment of in our lifetimes. These wonderful and sweeping promises God made to Abram, later Abraham, were mostly not fulfilled during Abram's lifetime. And yet, Abraham believed. This is one of the greatest examples of faith throughout the scriptures. The writer of the book of Hebrews begins the 11th chapter of that book with these words: "Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." And then the writer of Hebrews goes on to walk the reader through what we like to call today the Hall of Faith, in which the writer describes the faith of many others, including the faith of Abraham and Sarah in this way, starting with verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. What an example to you and me that Abraham and Sarah were. And may we, like them, believe and trust in what we see as greeting us from afar. The invisible Christ, the assurance of faith, the life with God forever in eternity. And as we can see from this passage and the rest of the narrative to come, Abraham and Sarah did not trust God with a perfect and unwavering faith. No, at times they took measures into their own hands and they made a mess of things. But they had enough trust in God for him to accomplish his perfect will to be done through them. This too is a great lesson for you and I. You know, Jesus said when he was talking about you and me these words, he said, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Thanks for watching, men. I pray that you continue to be richly blessed as you mine the riches of the Word of God.